My name is Daniel Marsh, and I want to start by saying I never wanted trouble with my neighbors. I grew up on this land. My grandfather cleared it with a mule and a plow back in the 1950s, and when he passed, the farm came to my father, and eventually to me. 62 acres of hayfields, a small orchard, a pond stocked with bluegill, and a gravel road that cuts through the property connecting the county highway to my house, my barn, and my equipment shed. That road has a name on old county records, Marsh Lane, and has been privately owned and privately maintained by my family for almost 70 years. I tell you all this because it matters. It matters for what happened next, and it matters because when people ask me how a disagreement over a strip of gravel turned into a legal battle that ended up rewriting the boundary lines of an entire subdivision, I always start at the beginning. So let me take you there. About 8 years ago, a developer bought the 300 acres bordering the east side of my property. Where there used to be woods and a couple of old tobacco barns, a new community went up. They called it Whispering Pines Estates, even though there wasn't a pine tree in sight after the bulldozers finished. 240 homes, curved streets with names like Sycamore Court and Heron's Landing, a clubhouse, a pool, the whole package. I didn't mind. Land changes hands, communities grow, and I figured as long as they stayed on their side of the property line, we'd get along fine. For the first few years, we did. New families moved in. Some of them even stopped by the farm stand I run on weekends during harvest season. Kids from the subdivision would ride their bikes down to look at the goats. It was neighborly. Then, about 2 years ago, a woman named Cheryl Dunbar was elected president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, and everything changed. I want to be fair here. I know these stories always paint the HOA president as the villain, and I'm sure Cheryl believed, at least at first, that she was doing right by her community. But belief and truth are not the same thing, and what started as a misunderstanding turned into something that cost her association a great deal of money, credibility, and, eventually, her position. It began with a letter. Official HOA letterhead, certified mail, the whole production. The letter stated that Marsh Lane, quote, has been identified as a public thoroughfare providing essential ingress and egress for Whispering Pines Estates residents, and that the Homeowners Association intended to petition the county to formally designate the road as public property, ensuring unrestricted access for all residents and their guests. I read that letter 3 times standing in my own kitchen, and each time I read it, I got a little more confused. My road had never been public. My grandfather built it. My father repaved sections of it with his own money. I paid property taxes on the parcel it sat on. There was no reason anyone would think it was public, unless someone had simply decided it would be convenient if it were. So I called the number on the letterhead, and I got Cheryl Dunbar. She was polite in that particular way people are polite when they've already made up their mind and are just going through the motions of a conversation. She explained that several residents in the new phase of the subdivision, the one closest to my property line, had been using Marsh Lane as a shortcut to reach the county highway, avoiding a longer route that looped through the main subdivision entrance and added about 4 minutes to their commute. She said the HOA's traffic committee had reviewed county maps and determined the road was, in her words, functionally public and that residents had a right to use it. I told her, as calmly as I could, that the road was privately owned, that it ran entirely through my deeded property, and that I had never granted an easement or right-of-way to Whispering Pines Estates or any of its residents. I told her I had the deed, I had the tax records, and I had 70 years of family history to back it up. Cheryl's response was that the HOA's legal counsel had reviewed publicly available county GIS data and believed the road was either public or subject to what she called an implied prescriptive easement due to historical use. I didn't know exactly what a prescriptive easement was at the time, but I would learn a lot more about it over the coming months. I hung up the phone that day and honestly thought it would blow over. I figured someone had made an error, maybe a mislabeled line on an online map, and once they looked into it properly, they'd realize their mistake and apologize. I was wrong. Within a week, I noticed cars I didn't recognize driving down Marsh Lane. Not just passing through, but idling near my barn, some of them turning around in my equipment yard. One evening I found a pickup truck parked at the edge of my hayfield, while the driver walked his dog along what he clearly believed was some kind of public walking path. When I asked him, politely, to please stay off my land, he told me the HOA had informed all residents that the road was open for public use, including foot traffic along the shoulder. That's when I realized this wasn't a clerical error. I want to pause here and say that farming is not a hobby for me. It's my livelihood. I have livestock that can spook from unfamiliar vehicles. I have equipment moving up and down that road during planting and harvest season, heavy machinery that isn't exactly compatible with joggers, dog walkers, and teenagers cutting through on their way to the gas station. Beyond the safety concerns, there was a simple matter of principle. This was my land. My family's land. And a homeowners association 200 yards away had decided, without ever contacting a surveyor, without ever reviewing an actual deed, that they were entitled to use it because it was convenient. I did what I probably should have done from the very first letter. I contacted a real estate attorney. Her name was Patricia Alvarez, and she specialized in property and boundary disputes. I brought her every document I had, my deed, my father's deed before that, my grandfather's original purchase agreement from 1957, and the property tax record showing that Marsh Lane's parcel had been assessed to my family continuously for decades. Patricia reviewed everything and told me what I already suspected. There was no recorded easement, no public dedication, nothing in the chain of title suggesting the road had ever been intended for public use. As far as the legal record showed, Marsh Lane belonged to me, in full, and had never belonged to anyone else. She drafted a formal cease and desist letter to the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, outlining the ownership history and requesting that the HOA immediately retract its newsletter, cease directing residents to use the road, and refrain from pursuing any public designation petition without a proper legal basis. I thought that would settle it. A letter from an attorney, backed by 70 years of clean title, should have ended the conversation right there. Instead, it escalated things. Cheryl Dunbar, rather than backing down, brought the matter to the HOA's board meeting and framed it as a fight for the community's rights. She told residents that I was, quote, attempting to block access that had existed for generations, and that the HOA needed to stand firm against what she called an aggressive property owner trying to intimidate a growing community. She specifically mentioned that her legal team believed the road qualified as a prescriptive easement because, according to her research, the road had been used informally by hunters, hikers, and rural residents for decades before the subdivision was built, and that this historical use created a public right regardless of the deed. This is where I want to explain something for anyone unfamiliar with property law, because it took me a while to understand it myself, and it became the crux of everything that followed. A prescriptive easement, generally speaking, requires open, continuous, and adverse use of a property for a legally defined period, and it requires that use to happen without the owner's permission and without the owner successfully stopping it. My family had never permitted continuous public use of Marsh Lane. Occasionally, decades ago, a neighbor might have asked permission to cross the land to reach a hunting spot, and my grandfather, being a friendly man, would say yes. But permitted use is the opposite of adverse use. It cannot form the basis of a prescriptive easement, because the whole concept requires that the use happen without the owner's consent. Cheryl's legal team, it turned out, was not actually a team of real estate attorneys. It was a single HOA-affiliated general counsel who typically handled bylaw disputes and collections issues, not complex property law. He had apparently advised the board based on second-hand accounts from a few older residents in the area who remembered always being able to drive down that road, without verifying whether that use had ever been permissive. The HOA board voted, 3-2, to move forward with a petition to the county requesting that Marsh Lane be classified as a public road, citing historical community use as justification. Cheryl announced this decision at the next general meeting, and from what I heard second-hand from a resident who attended, she painted me as an obstacle to community access rather than a private landowner defending his property. Around this same time, things at the farm got worse. The occasional wandering dog walker became a steady stream of cars. Someone posted in a community social media group with directions using Marsh Lane as the recommended route to the highway, and traffic on my private road tripled within a matter of weeks. I had 2 near misses with my tractor. My chickens got loose twice after someone left a side gate open, apparently thinking it was a public access point. I put up no trespassing signs. Someone tore 3 of them down. I called Cheryl directly one more time before things went further, hoping we could resolve this without a formal county hearing. I explained, again, calmly, that the road was not public, that the petition had no legal foundation, and that continued encouragement of residents to trespass could expose the HOA to liability if someone got hurt near farm equipment or livestock. Her response, and I remember this clearly because Patricia had advised me to take notes on every conversation, was that she had, quote, reviewed the county's online parcel viewer and it showed Marsh Lane as, quote, an unlabeled access route consistent with public right-of-way patterns in older rural subdivisions, and that she trusted the county's own petition process to sort out the details. I want to note something here. because it turned out to be important later. The county's online GIS mapping system, the same one Cheryl kept citing, was known to be imprecise for rural parcels older than about 50 years. Many of these parcels had been surveyed using older methods, meets and bounds descriptions tied to physical landmarks like creek beds, fence lines, and old tree stumps, rather than modern GPS coordinates. When the county eventually digitized these old surveys for the online system decades later, some lines got approximated, some got misdrawn entirely, and Marsh Lane, unfortunately, fell into a small pocket of the county map that had never been corrected. On the digital map, the road appeared as an unlabeled gap between parcels, which Cheryl's legal advisor interpreted as evidence it might be public land that simply hadn't been formally documented. It was, in short, a graphic rendering error. Not evidence of anything. The county scheduled a public hearing to review the HOA's petition. I remember the morning of that hearing clearly. Patricia and I arrived with a thick binder of documentation. My grandfather's original 1957 deed, my father's 1981 deed, my own 2011 deed after inheriting the property, decades of property tax statements, and letters from the county assessor's office confirming continuous private ownership of the Marsh Lane parcel. Cheryl arrived with her legal advisor, a printed copy of the GIS map, and a petition signed by around 90 residents who supported public designation of the road, mostly because it would shave a few minutes off their commute. The hearing officer, a county administrator named Mr. Halloran, listened to both sides. Cheryl's advisor argued the prescriptive easement theory, citing testimony from two elderly residents who claimed they remembered using the road, quote, whenever they wanted going back to the 1970s. Patricia countered by noting that both of these residents had, in their own written statements, described specific instances of asking my grandfather or father for permission before using the road for hunting access. That admission alone undercut the entire adverse use argument. Then Mr. Halloran said something that changed the direction of everything. He noted that the county's GIS mapping system was known to be unreliable for parcels in that section of the county, particularly parcels that predated the 1960s digital survey standards, and that any resolution of this dispute would require pulling the original recorded survey from the county archive, not the digital approximation everyone had been arguing over. He continued the hearing for 30 days and ordered both parties to obtain a certified copy of the original recorded plat survey for the Marsh Lane parcel from the county's physical records office. This is where the story takes the turn I think most people watching this have been waiting for. Patricia and I went down to the county records office ourselves rather than waiting on the county's timeline. The clerk there, a wonderfully patient woman named Ruth who had worked in that archive for almost 30 years, pulled the microfiche and then the original bound survey book from 1957, the same year my grandfather purchased the land. It took her almost 2 hours to locate it, because the original survey had been filed under my grandfather's name rather than a street address, since the road hadn't been named yet at the time. When Ruth finally laid the original survey out on the table, it was beautiful in a way I hadn't expected. Hand-drawn, precise, with the surveyor's careful lettering marking every boundary point, every distance in chains and links, the old-fashioned unit surveyors used at the time. The road that would become Marsh Lane was drawn clearly, running entirely within the boundary of the parcel my grandfather had purchased. There was a small notation near the road, in the surveyor's handwriting, that read private access, granted no public dedication. That single phrase, 5 words written by a surveyor almost 70 years ago, ended up settling the entire dispute. But here's the part that truly changed everything, the part one didn't expect at all. As Ruth continued flipping through the archive survey books to find supplementary documentation, she pulled the original plat map for the land that would eventually become Whispering Pines Estates, filed decades later when that property was subdivided and sold to the developer. When Patricia laid the two surveys side by side, comparing the boundary coordinates, something didn't line up. The original 1957 survey of my grandfather's land showed the eastern boundary line running along a specific creek bed, using the creek as the natural boundary marker, which was extremely common for surveys of that era. But when the Whispering Pines Estate subdivision was surveyed decades later for development, the surveyor hired by the developer had used a different, more modern method, tying the boundary to a benchmark coordinate rather than the physical creek. Over the decades, the creek had shifted slightly, as small waterways often do, and the coordinate-based survey from the developer's team had been drawn using the creek's newer position rather than accounting for the original historical boundary intent. The result was that a strip of land, not enormous, but not insignificant either, about 2 acres running along the eastern edge of my property, had actually been included within the boundaries of Whispering Pines Estate's recorded plat, specifically within what the HOA had designated as a common area containing a small retention pond and a section of walking trail. According to the original 1957 survey, that 2 acres legally belonged to the Marsh family. According to the HOA's own recorded documents, they had been treating it as association-owned common property for 8 years, mowing it, maintaining it, and even installing a small footbridge over what they believed was community land. In trying to prove that my private road was actually public, Cheryl Dunbar and the Whispering Pines HOA had inadvertently triggered a full review of the boundary surveys, uncovering an error that revealed the HOA had been improperly occupying 2 acres of my family's land for nearly a decade. I won't pretend I didn't feel a certain grim satisfaction reading that discovery, but I want to be honest about how I approached it, because I think it says something about how these situations should be handled. I didn't want to bulldoze the footbridge or fence off the pond out of spite. I wanted the truth established, clearly and permanently, so nobody would have to argue about it again. At the continued hearing 30 days later, Patricia presented both findings. First, the original 1957 survey definitively established Marsh Lane as private property with no history of public dedication, ending the HOA's petition entirely. Mr. Halloran dismissed the petition outright, noting that the prescriptive easement argument was further undermined by the residents' own admissions of having asked for permission decades earlier. Second, and this is the part that visibly stunned the HOA's legal advisor, Patricia presented the boundary discrepancy showing the 2-acre encroachment. She had already had a licensed surveyor conduct a modern GPS survey confirming that the original 1957 boundary, properly interpreted, placed that section of land within my property, not the HOA's common area. Mr. Halloran recommended the matter proceed to civil resolution between the parties rather than being decided at the county level, since it now involved a private boundary dispute rather than a road classification question. But the county's own findings on the record were clear enough that neither side had much room left to argue. In the weeks that followed, the HOA's insurance carrier and legal counsel got heavily involved, because now the association faced potential liability for 8 years of unauthorized use and improvement of land that wasn't theirs, including the retention pond infrastructure and the footbridge. Rather than pursue a lengthy and expensive court battle, Patricia and I negotiated a settlement. The HOA formally acknowledged my ownership of the 2 acres, paid a reasonable licensing fee for their continued use of the retention pond, which genuinely was useful for managing stormwater runoff for the subdivision, and agreed to relocate the walking trail off my property within 6 months. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue additional damages for the years of unauthorized use, mostly because I didn't want years more of litigation hanging over either of us, and because the retention pond arrangement actually made sense for both parties going forward. As for Marsh Lane, the HOA formally retracted its newsletter, sent a corrected notice to all 240 households clarifying that the road was private property with no public access, and removed the shortcut directions from their community pages. I reinstalled my no trespassing signs, added a locking gate at the county highway entrance for good measure, and traffic returned to what it had been before all of this started, which is to say, none at all except my own family and the occasional delivery truck. Cheryl Dunbar did not run for re-election as HOA president that year. From what I understand, several residents were frustrated that the board had pursued an aggressive legal petition based on an inaccurate online map rather than doing the basic diligence of pulling the original survey from the start, diligence that ended up costing the HOA a meaningful settlement and a fair amount of embarrassment. I don't say that with any particular satisfaction. I think Cheryl believed she was advocating for her community, and in a strange way, I understand the impulse to fight for a shortcut that makes 240 people's daily commute a little easier. But belief without verification is a dangerous thing, especially when it involves someone else's property. What stays with me most from this whole experience isn't the 2 acres, honestly, though I'm glad to have that boundary correctly and permanently established now. It's the reminder of how much history is contained in those old survey books sitting in county archives, gathering dust, waiting for someone to actually pull them out and read the surveyor's careful handwriting instead of trusting a digitized map that was never meant to be the final word. My grandfather stood on that land with a surveyor in 1957, and the notes that surveyor made in pencil and ink ended up being the exact thing that settled a dispute almost 70 years later. There's something almost poetic about that, if you think about it long enough. These days, Marsh Lane is quiet again. The retention pond arrangement with the HOA works fine, and honestly, the new HOA president, a retired schoolteacher named Frank who took over after Cheryl stepped down, has been nothing but reasonable to deal with. We've even talked about setting up a small easement agreement for emergency vehicle access only, properly documented this time, with an actual survey and an actual attorney involved from the start, rather than a newsletter and a guess. If there's a lesson in all of this, I think it's a simple one. Ownership isn't just about what a map shows you at a glance. It's about the paper trail underneath it, the deeds and surveys that document exactly how a piece of land came to belong to someone, and how those boundaries were drawn in the first place. Before you claim someone else's property is public, or common, or fair game because it's convenient, it might be worth taking the time to check the original records. You might find they tell a very different story than the one you expected. In my case, that original survey didn't just protect what was already mine. It revealed something nobody had known for 8 years, and in the end, it set things right for everyone involved.